Frontier Hearts. The stagecoach robbery happened so fast that Margaret Wheeler barely had time to pray. One moment she was clutching her father's Bible, watching the Montana wilderness roll past the window. The next, masked riders surrounded them, shots cracking through the autumn air. When the dust settled and the bandits rode off with the Strongbucks, Margaret found herself stranded on a desolate road with a wounded driver and a cowboy who looked at her like she was more trouble than she was worth. "Can you ride?" he'd asked, his jaw tight as granite. She nodded, though her hands trembled. "Then stop shaking," he growled, swinging into his saddle. "Or I'll be riding all night to keep you from falling off that horse." Margaret Wheeler had learned early that a missionary's daughter was expected to be meek, dutiful, and accepting of whatever hardships the Lord saw fit to deliver. At 19, she'd buried her mother in Ohio, nursed her father through fever in Kansas, and now found herself in Montana territory with nothing but $40 sewn into her petticoat hem and a reference letter for a teaching position in a town called Sweetgrass. The letter was currently being examined by a broad-shouldered cowboy named Daniel Hayes, his eyes narrowing as he read by firelight. "Sweetgrass is 3 days' ride from here," he said, handing back the creased paper. "And you don't look like you've sat on a horse for more than an hour in your life." "I can manage," Margaret said, though her legs already ached from the brief ride to this makeshift camp. The stagecoach driver, old Henry, was sleeping fitfully nearby, his shoulder bandaged with strips torn from Margaret's second-best petticoat. "I appreciate you stopping to help us, Mr. Hayes." "Daniel," he corrected, poking at the fire with a stick. "And I didn't stop to help. I was tracking those raiders when I heard the shots." He looked up at her, his face all hard plains and shadows in the flickering light. "You always travel alone?" "My father died 3 months ago. Cholera," she said matter-of-factly, though the wound was still raw. "There's nothing left for me back east. The teaching position in Sweetgrass is all I have." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, not quite sympathy, but recognition, like he understood about having nothing left. "Sweetgrass is growing fast. Copper mine opened last year. They need teachers." He stood, brushing dirt from his chaps. "I've got a ranch about a day's ride from here. The Twin Pines. My daughter's there with my foreman's wife. She's 10, and she hasn't had proper schooling in 2 years." Margaret studied him in the firelight. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. A widower, she guessed from the way he mentioned his daughter with a mixture of love and helplessness. "I'm contracted to teach in Sweetgrass," she said carefully. "I know. But you won't make it there on that half-dead coach horse, and Henry won't be fit to travel for a week." Daniel crossed his arms. "Here's what I'm offering. Come to Twin Pines. Teach Lucy, my daughter, while we send word to Sweetgrass about what happened. When Henry's healed, I'll see you both safely to town. You'll have a roof, meals, and I'll pay you for the teaching. Fair wage." It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to stay at a bachelor's ranch, even with a child and other people present. But proper was a luxury Margaret couldn't afford anymore. "Your foreman's wife will be there?" she asked. "Rachel Foster. She'll see to it everything's respectable." A hint of amusement touched his stern features. "I'm not looking to compromise you, Miss Wheeler. I'm looking to give my daughter something I can't, an education." Margaret made her decision. "Then I accept. Temporarily." "Temporarily," Daniel agreed. But something in his tone suggested he didn't believe in temporary any more than she did when it came to Montana territory. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Margaret with its comfort. She taught Lucy at the kitchen table each morning, the girl bright and hungry for knowledge. In the afternoons, she helped Rachel with household tasks, learning the specific skills required for ranch life. In the evenings, after Lucy was in bed, Margaret often found herself on the porch with Daniel, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. They talked about simple things at first: the weather, the cattle, Lucy's progress. But gradually, as the nights grew colder and the conversations longer, they talked about harder things. Daniel spoke of his wife Catherine, who'd been a schoolteacher in Denver before marrying him. Margaret talked about her father, his endless optimism even in the face of poverty and hardship. "That's when I decided to come west," she said one evening, wrapped in a shawl against the October chill. There was nothing holding me back east anymore. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. This country hardens some people, breaks others. But if you can stand the winter and the isolation and the work, it gives something back. Space to breathe. Room to build something that matters. Is that why you stayed after your wife died? Leaving felt like abandoning her memory. He turned to look at Margaret. You planning to stay after you get to Sweetgrass? I don't know, Margaret admitted. I've never stayed anywhere longer than 2 years. It wasn't an argument exactly, but there was an edge to their words, a recognition that they stood on opposite sides of something fundamental. Daniel had built his life around staying. Margaret had built hers around movement, around not getting too attached to any one place or person. And yet, sitting on his porch under a canopy of stars, Margaret felt the first dangerous stirrings of attachment. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Margaret's arrival. A young ranch hand burst into the yard, bleeding and breathless. There's been an accident. Stampede spooked the herd. Mr. Hayes's horse went down, his legs pinned under the animal. Margaret's mind snapped into focus with crystalline clarity. How far? An hour's ride, maybe less if you push it. Saddle the gentlest horse you've got for me. Bring rope, blankets, and whiskey if there is any. Margaret was already moving toward the door. Miss Wheeler, you can't, Rachel started. I can and I will. My father tended to injuries for 20 years in frontier towns that had no doctors. I learned at his side. I'm not sitting here while Daniel bleeds out in a pasture. The ride was the longest hour of Margaret's life. When they crested a rise and saw Daniel's leg trapped beneath his fallen horse, Margaret felt her stomach drop. But this wasn't the time for fear. She dropped to her knees beside him. How long has he been pinned? 20 minutes, maybe more. Wait, Margaret, Daniel's voice was strained. What the hell are you doing here? Saving your stubborn life, apparently. She ran her hands along his trapped leg, feeling carefully. Can you feel your toes? Yes. Good. That's good. She looked up at the men. We need to lever the horse up enough to pull him free. They worked together, and suddenly Daniel was free. Margaret collapsed beside him, her hands shaking now that the crisis moment had passed. Let me see the leg. It wasn't broken, miraculously, but badly bruised. She used strips of cloth and straight branches to splint it, her father's teachings guiding her hands. Daniel watched her work, something shifting in his expression. Where did you learn this? My father. She tied off the final knot. You'll need to stay off it for at least 2 weeks. No riding, no working cattle. Just rest. When they got him home, Lucy threw her arms around Margaret's waist, sobbing. Over Lucy's head, Margaret's eyes met Daniel's. He was watching them with an expression so raw and vulnerable that Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. This wasn't temporary. This hadn't been temporary from the moment she'd ridden hell-bent across Montana to reach him. Later that night, after Lucy had finally fallen asleep, Margaret sat beside Daniel's bed, checking his fever. You didn't have to ride out there, Daniel said. I could have, Margaret agreed. But I didn't. Why not? She met his eyes. Because somewhere between teaching Lucy arithmetic and sitting on your porch watching the mountains, I stopped planning to leave. Because when I heard you were hurt, I couldn't breathe until I knew you were alive. Because I've spent my whole life not putting down roots, and suddenly I can't imagine leaving Twin Pines. Daniel reached for her hand. I haven't looked at a woman since Catherine died. Then you showed up all prim and proper on the outside, but tough as rawhide underneath. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Margaret Wheeler, I'm asking you to stay. Not temporarily. Not as Lucy's teacher. Stay as my wife. Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. I don't have a dowry. I don't have anything but $40 and borrowed clothes. I don't want your money. I want you. Your strength and your kindness. The way you make Lucy laugh. He squeezed her hand. Marry me, Margaret. Choose Montana. Choose us. She thought about 19 years of never belonging anywhere long enough to call it home. She thought about Lucy's arms around her waist and Daniel's eyes watching her across the supper table. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the front room of Twin Pines, with Lucy standing between Margaret and Daniel, holding both their hands. When Daniel promised to love and cherish her until death parted them, his voice was steady and sure. When it was Margaret's turn, she looked at Lucy first, then at Daniel. "I promise to love you and Lucy with all my heart. To help build a home worthy of Catherine's memory. To face Montana winters and summer droughts and whatever else this territory throws at us." Her voice caught. "I promise to stay." When they broke apart from their first kiss as husband and wife, Lucy threw her arms around both of them, and Margaret felt the final piece of her heart click into place. As the sun set and the celebration continued, Margaret found herself on the porch for a moment alone, watching the mountains turn purple in the twilight. "Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "You getting cold feet already?" "Not a chance." Margaret leaned back against him. "I was just thinking about how I ended up here. All the accidents and coincidences that had to happen." "You believe in divine providence?" Daniel asked. "I used to think so. Now I think maybe we make our own providence. One choice at a time." She turned in his arms to face him. "I chose to get on that stage. You chose to help instead of riding past. We both chose this. Best choice I ever made," Daniel said, and kissed her again as the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky. Inside the barn, Lucy's laughter rang clear and bright. On the porch of Twin Pines, Margaret Wheeler Hayes stood wrapped in her husband's arms and finally felt like she'd come home. The Montana Territory was harsh and beautiful, demanding and rewarding in equal measure. Margaret had arrived with nothing but borrowed clothes and a heart armored against attachment. She was staying with a family, a home, and roots that reached deep into the unforgiving soil. The mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, and somewhere in their shadows, Margaret swore she heard her father's voice on the wind, approving and proud.